Hi, good afternoon or good morning, everyone, depending on where you're listening in today. Welcome to this new edition of our Research Conversations. My name is Mariana de Gesa, and I am a member of the climate change team here at AFD, the French Development Agency. I have been given the honor to moderate this session and this webinar today, so very pleased to be surrounded by all this very interesting audience today. AFD is very excited to host this webinar on this very important topic of the assessment of developing country macroeconomic exposure to the low carbon transition. We hope this webinar will be an opportunity for you to get familiar with our most recent publication on the topic. It will be an opportunity as well to exchange views with other researchers and practitioners on the issue of climate risks, and of course to discuss around the possibility of integrating these research methods in upcoming climate risk assessment methodologies. For AFD, and if you give me a few minutes, I wanted to introduce why this is an important topic to us. Climate risk is an issue that we have included in our latest climate strategy, and we have included in it our ambition to actively advance and contribute to ongoing discussions on the topic. We have been encouraged to do so, of course, by the French regulator, who have included obligations on this matter as part of the different articles in the energy transition law, but we are also convinced that this is part of our mandate as a development bank. In order to move forward on the issue, we as the AFD group, we have set up a roadmap, a transversal roadmap that mobilizes a number of teams inside our institutions that is composed of 4 pillars. A first pillar that is related to our status as a financial institutions and relates to the integration of climate-related risks into our climate risk analysis methods. A second and third pillar of the roadmap are more linked to our mandate as a development bank, where we understand and we are striving efforts to include this issue of climate-related risks in our public policy dialogue. And we are also striving to include the issue in our discussions and technical exchanges between our different financial partners through technical support and financial support. Moreover, our fourth pillar is dedicated to the contribution that we can make as a development bank to international debates and to the definition of upcoming standards related to climate-related risks. So as you can imagine, the topic that gathers us today allows us to advance through the implementation of these 4 pillars of our climate risk transversal roadmap. So a few technical points related to the webinar. As you can see on the right-hand side, there is a chat function and a question function. So we will kindly ask you that if you have any clarification questions or issues that you would like to bring to the debate, please do not hesitate to write them on as we move forward through the discussion. At the end, we will try to address all of them if we have the time, or we can get back to you on a written manner. On the other hand, in terms of the content of today's session, I can say that we will start by a presentation by Guillermo of our most recent paper on developing countries' macroeconomic exposure to the low carbon transition. His presentation will last 30 minutes, and then we will have 2 presentations made by 2 discussants, each presentation for 15 minutes by Sebastian and Cecile. So let me start by introducing this very distinguished panel. I want to start by saying that Guillermo, he holds a PhD in land economy from Cambridge University and is currently responsible for industrial and macroeconomic analysis, focusing mainly on the impacts of the low carbon transition in developing countries. He works mainly with input-output analysis and macroeconomic models to identify systemic risks arising from intersectional relationships. And Guillermo will be making this, as I said, initial presentation of the paper as one of its lead authors. Then we're going to have 2 discussants. We will have Sebastian Valdecantos, that from a researcher standpoint will discuss the content that will be presented by Guillermo earlier on, and he will also bring some expertise of his own, as he has developed some similar research work in the case of Argentina. Sebastian is an assistant professor at Aalborg University in Denmark. He specializes in the development of stock flow consistent models to analyze the macroeconomic dynamics of developing countries. He has recently been working on an SFC model with input-output disaggregation to analyze the challenges of the green transition of Argentina. And finally, the last discussant will be Cécile Valadier. He's our Deputy Director of Economic Assessment and Public Policy Department here at the French Development Agency since August 2017. Her team is mainly tasked with monitoring the macroeconomic and financial situation of emerging and developing countries and assess country and sovereign risks. So she will basically be discussing the content of the paper in a look of how this research work can be integrated into upcoming climate risk assessment methodologies. Prior to this position, Cécile has previously worked as a senior economist for the World Bank in the credit risk department and joined the bank through the Young Professionals programs in 2012. So thanks a lot to all of them for being here today, and of course to all of you for joining us. We hope that you will enjoy these presentations and that you will enjoy the discussion as well. So with not further delay, Guillermo, to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mariana, for this presentation. It's very interesting to discuss with Cecilia and Sebastian. The paper we just published here at AFD, which is called Developing Countries Macroeconomic Exposure to Low Carbon Transition. This paper was like an effort of 5 people, 10 hands, let's say. We are developing it for a long time, and I will try to present it very briefly, but trying to show how can we use this information and how we advance in quantifying these exposure and the risk of the low carbon transition. First of all, I will present very briefly the framework and why we are looking at these 3 dimensions: external, fiscal, and socio-economic dimensions. Then I will go deep into the analysis, the country analysis, and look at the countries. What are the countries that are more external exposed, the countries that present the higher fiscal exposure and socio-economic exposure. And then we develop a method to compare countries and to group them into different clusters, and I will present briefly for you the ideas of doing this and why we are doing this. And the main issue here and the most important thing is that we cannot just sum up risks, because if you have like external risk and a fiscal risk, they have different impact into the countries in different aspects, and so we have to look at each one very, very closely. So the idea is to present here not our evaluation saying that is the external, is the fiscal or the socio-economic, but looking at each one very carefully. Well, basically the main idea of the low carbon transition, or thinking about like more broadly into ecological transition, is that it's a structural change, as the other large structural change that we had in our history in the world. Like the first, second, and third revolutions are specific types of structural change too. For example, in the first industrial revolution, we had some industries that emerged, like textiles, cotton. The second industrial revolution, we have like chemicals, electricity, and the third, electronics. And here we have like a large structural change where some low carbon emission industries will emerge and high carbon emission industries will decline. So you have like a different type of structural change, because it's not organic, it's led by deliberate policies. Governments will decide which are these industries. Changing preference, people will change the way they consume. And also, of course, technological change that will lead to some products or lead to some specific industries. And we can, of course, based in different technologies, we will have more of some products, less of other products, according to the price of these products, according to the technology that is developed in the world in general. And countries, looking at going from like the global perspective to the local perspective, countries will be impacted differently according to the structure of production, trade, and finance. Basically, if you have countries that are more dependent on some industries, they will be more impacted, more dependent in terms of the sectoral linkage they have with other industries, in terms of the trade they have with other countries, and also, of course, how they finance these industries. And the idea is that during the transition process, there will be relevant changes in world demand that will impact different countries according to their dependence. We are looking here at three important aspects that we define as the key aspects during the transition process for developing countries. It's completely different from when you're looking at developing and developed countries. First of all, the importance of raising foreign currency, because most of the developing countries, they have the growth, and Sebastian will discuss a lot on these afterwards, but because his work is mainly on this. Most of the developing countries, they face balance of payment constraints because they need to import capital goods and inputs to do this transition. Because they do not produce these goods, of course, they produce some of these goods, but not all of these goods. They need to export, but at the same point, exports may drop if they depend a lot of these industries on their export basket. These industries are also, we have to look at the importance of these industries to avoid fiscal imbalances. If the country depends a lot on the industries to raise fiscal revenues, you can have fiscal imbalances, and during this process, during the transition process, there will be the need for huge public investment and huge expenses to retraining workers in social security system. And because of these, the countries that face fiscal imbalance cannot go through the transition process very slowly. They will face a lot of problems facing this transition during this transition process. And finally, we have to look also at the social aspects. And here we will focus on two important things, that is the importance of these industries to generate employment and paying wages. Because even though the general impact of green transition or low carbon transition can be positive for the world as a whole, because you're employing more people in some green activities, the effects will be very heterogeneous across countries. So you have some countries more impacted and some countries less impacted. So basically, how we do these analyses and how we consider what we call exposure, vulnerability, and risks. Based on the country's dependence on these sunset industries, we discuss the exposure of these countries to the low carbon transition. Why? Because if the dependence is high, the country will be more exposed to this transition than those countries that has a lower dependence. However, countries doesn't need to be vulnerable just because they are exposed. For example, we have China. China is always a good example, because even though this is a country that we are going to see, they present a very high exposure because they depend a lot on these industries, because they have fiscal stability, they have like huge reserves, international reserves. Not necessarily it's a vulnerable country. And moreover, in the case of China, again, it's a very good example. They have an incredible capacity to adapt to other industries. They have all the capabilities. They have the technological, productive, educational less, but especially technological and productive capabilities to move to other industries, especially these green industries. So it's definitely not, even though it's a very exposed country, it's not a very risk country in this sense. So we have to look at these three aspects very carefully to understand the different aspects of each country. Here, it's I just put here just for you to see how we look at these, and then we have these external, fiscal, and socio-economic dimensions, and we have different variables to evaluate the dependence. Of course, the dependence is the importance of these industries. First, to raise foreign currency, then to raise tax revenues, and then to generate employment. And then you have, for example, different variables to analyze the sensitivity and the capacity to adapt. In terms of the capacity to adapt, I will discuss a little bit later, but we use the Green Complexity Index, which is an index that shows, try to measure the capacities, the competences, the capabilities of the countries to move from one industry to another, especially in moving towards green industries. Well, first of all, we have to identify what are the sunset industries. And we use two measures to identify these industries. First, CO2 equivalent or CO2 emission intensity by sector. In the sector itself, and upward emission, like to produce electricity, for example, to produce electricity, even though in the process of production electricity, you have some emissions, but you also have emissions when you are extracting fossil fuels. You also have emissions when you are, here we have like the metal products, petroleum and chemicals. These products, to produce them, you have a lot of emissions, but also to produce the inputs that you use to produce them, you also have emissions. So we separate here the high and medium emission intensive industries, and we have the downstream emissions, which are mainly those industries that during the process of production, they do not emit a lot, but these products, the products that these industries are producing, they are used by other industries, and the use of these products by other industries is emitting a lot. So we define here four important industries. Here, recycling is also a very emitting industry, but of course, recycling we cannot consider as a sunset industry, just because it's replacing other industries. But we define mining and quarrying, chemicals, which includes refined petroleum and non-mineral metals, metal products, and wood and paper. These four potential sunset industries, and afterwards we are going to evaluate more specifically each one of them. Those countries that depend on these industries are those that are more exposed to the low carbon transition. Well, going deep into the analysis, here we have like in the vertical axis, we have this net raise of foreign currency, which measures the external exposure. For example, you have like the top country is DZA, which is Algeria. Algeria is a country that depends a lot on the sunset industries in terms of their exports. Actually, its exports discounted by the imported inputs necessary to produce these products. Kuwait is also a very important country in this sense. And going a little bit to the right side, we also have Russia, Norway, and Iran. Well, the vertical axis is showing the exposure. The horizontal axis will have the green complexity potential rank, which is showing the capacity of the country to adapt. So what's the difference between, for example, Norway and Russia, which is the top right, and Algeria, Libya, Iraq, Kuwait, which is in the top left? Basically, what happens is that although all these countries are very exposed, external exposed to the low carbon transition, Norway and Russia, they have like a higher capacity to move from from high carbon emission industries to low carbon emission industries, especially green industries, because they have the capabilities, they have the technological and productive capabilities to move their production. So looking for a more dynamic perspective, not only looking at what they are producing now, but looking at what they can produce given what they are producing now, these countries are in a much better condition. These countries in the top right are in a much better condition than the top left. Of course, if you are in the bottom, you're less exposed, so you don't need to of course, you need to worry about this, but relatively to those countries that are in the superior, the up part of the graph, you are in a much better condition. Well, and here we analyze what's the main driving of the external risks. The main driving of the external risk, as you can see, is the blue bars, which is mining and quarrying. Mining is the sector where countries depend on, those countries that are very exposed, depend the most in terms of the sunset industries that these countries depend the most. Here we have all countries, not all, the most exposed countries. And as you see, for example, the last one is Algeria again, which is basically depends on chemicals a little bit, but mainly on mining. Mining is the main driving of the external exposure. When you look at fiscal exposure, fiscal risks in general, we have a different scenario. The horizontal axis now is the axis, is showing the importance of sunset industries for tax, for raising tax, let's say. But we are considering also the indirect impact, which means that if I'm producing a product that is not a sunset industries, but is used by a sunset industries as an input, this product will also be impacted. So we are considering the direct and indirect impact. As you're going to see in a few minutes, these indirect impacts are more relevant for some countries or less relevant for the others. In the vertical axis, we have the production of these sunset industries. Of course, those countries that are in the top right position in this graph, in this chart, they are very exposed in terms of the fiscal revenues, and they cannot tax other products because they are already taxing the products that they are very exposed. In the right top, right down, we have countries that tax a lot sunset industries, and that because of these they have a very high fiscal exposure, but they have space to tax another products if these products decline in terms of share of production, exports. If these countries move to other products, they have space to tax a little bit more. Of course, it's not the best situation in the world because you still depend a lot on these industries, but you can move your taxation system towards these other industries once let's imagine the relevance of these sunset industries is declining in these economies. And the color of the points, which is this GCP, is the green complexity potential, shows that exactly the thing that we are showing before, the capacity to adapt. So again, we have China and Korea and the top countries in the right. They are exactly in the middle there, but it's in the horizontal X, but they are in the top part of the vertical X. What happens that these two countries, even though they are very fiscal exposed, as we're gonna see, they can move to other industries, they can adapt their production to other products, and then they have the capacity, this dynamic capacity to adapt. On the other hand, those countries that are in the very red color, like Kuwait, Trinidad and Tobago, Bolivia, Venezuela, a little bit less Ecuador, but Paraguay, Algeria, these countries, they are extremely dependent on these industries, so they are very exposed, and they cannot adapt their production, so they are in a very not so good situation where they can move to green products easily. Well, again, when you look at what is the sectors that are responsible for the fiscal risk, it moves a little bit from the mining sector to the chemical and this gray part, which is the indirect impacts. So you have some countries here that they are extremely dependent on these industries, and they are producing for these industries. But the thing is, like, they depend on these industries because they produce inputs, even if like agriculture or other products, they're producing input for the sunset industries. And once these industries decline, in the long term, or even not so long term, these industries that are producing for these sunset industries will also be impacted. Well, finally, we have the socio-economic risk, and here in the horizontal X, we have wages, and the vertical X, we have employment. So those countries which are in the top right, these countries are those that employ a lot of people in these industries and pay high wages. And the color here is a level of social protection, which is a way to measure the vulnerability of these countries. If you look, for example, again, Korea, they paid a lot of wages, like the wage bill depends a lot on these industries, and they generate a lot of employment. But because they have a social protection system that is very strong, they can not easily, but they can adapt they are less vulnerable, let's say, even though they are in a situation where they are very exposed. Well, going forward to the comparative analysis, where we are trying to identify grouping these countries and compare these countries, we have this, I like this graph because we took some countries here that is the first one is Trinidad and Tobago, then Bolivia, Venezuela, Kuwait, Zimbabwe, Ethiopia, Paraguay, and Ecuador. As you can see, each point here is one of the dimensions. As you can see, for each country, the explanation for the exposure is different. In the case of Trinidad and Tobago, which is the first in the top left, what happens is that the indirect impacts, which is the gray part, is the summation of direct and indirect. The blue is the direct. The indirect impact is very important to explain the country's exposure, especially when it comes to paying wages and generating employment. If you look at Kuwait or Venezuela, it's not so much the indirect impact, but it's more on the direct impact. And if you look at Zimbabwe, Ethiopia, Paraguay, and Ecuador, they are less external exposed and more internal, like depending more on these sectors, both in terms of production, in terms of taxation, in terms of employment generation, and paying wages. So it's for each country is a little bit different. And here's one example. We work with Gabon. And in the case of Gabon, it's very interesting because, as you can see, here is breaking into sectors. What are the importance of the sectors in terms of raising foreign currency and raising tax? We have mining, and mining is mainly mining as a foreign currency raiser, but this sector is not too much tax raiser. On the other hand, you have chemicals, which is a very important sector in terms of taxation, but not in terms of foreign currency, generating foreign currency, because Gabon exports much more mining and produce domestically a lot of chemicals, especially refined petroleum and other products. So why I'm showing these and why I'm taking Gabon, which is one of the many examples that we have to look at different exposure dimensions. It's difficult to say just like, okay, this country depends a lot on these industries. It's more like why they depend on these industries. In the case of Gabon, they depend a lot of mining to export in terms of their exports. In terms of taxation, they depend a lot of chemicals, which is the one that's the most right, the right one, almost like the very high, because it's direct and indirect. The chemicals is a sector which is very important for the economy as a whole. Well, we cluster these countries into groups. We use some mathematical dynamic analysis to cluster these countries, and you find out that we have 4 different groups of countries. Those that are in purple, which are the very exposed countries, the much exposed countries, and you have in the top of the graph some countries that are exposed due to the red, pink one. Is exposure due to their external dependence, so they are very external exposed. In the blue group is those countries that are very social exposure due to socioeconomic exposure. And finally, the gray part is those countries that are not very exposed. Here we plot this data to understand these. As you can see, the purple is always more exposed than the others. They are all in the right part of the distribution. And the blue and the pink, they switch position because the pink is pink or red, I don't know. The pink is more on exports and the blue is more on wages. So what we can see is that, and here we have this map that shows, for example, that Russia, China, Algeria, of course, they are in purple, which means that they are very high exposed countries, Bolivia and Venezuela as well. You have some countries like Brazil, India, South Africa, which are more exposed due to the socio-economic. So in spite of not being very external exposed, these industries are not very important relatively to the others in terms of exports, but they are very relevant in terms of generating weights. And of course, you have countries like Peru or Colombia, I will not say Canada and Australia, that are very exposed due to the external exposure. They depend a lot of these industries, these sunset industries, but they depend on mainly due to their exports, and they depend on these industries to raise foreign currency, to avoid balance of payment constraints. Well, this is basically the study that we published in this working paper, and the idea is to go forward and try to identify more precisely what are these industries, what exactly these data can show. Specifically, for example, you have now the CBAM, which is like the carbon border adjustment mechanism that the European Commission wants to impose, and if you have data, more detailed data, more disaggregated data on the products, the 5 products that they are imposing these, we can see the external exposure to specific products and not to general sectors, like, for example, as we did here. Well, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Guillaume. I see that we have one clarification question that perhaps we can address before moving on with the panel. And of course, we can get more questions later on from the audience. So there's a question from Claudia Latorre. He's asking, he finds it odd that in your research you are consider the metal industry as a sunset industry, taking into account that under some opinions in the energy transition is in large a transition from a fuel-based energy system to a metal commodity-based energy system. So do you have any insights around that?
It's a very interesting question, because it's like exactly why we're trying to refine the results, because the thing is, like, if you take, for example, the CBAM that I was talking like just now, basically they focus on iron metals, aluminum and iron, and they are imposing the European Commission is discussing these. The European Union is trying to impose some carbon prices on these products, and it's more like a product-specific thing than a sector thing. So the idea is that these sectors will be impacted, but mostly who will be more impacted is those countries that produce producing these sectors, specific products with very high carbon intensity. So it's not the sector as a whole, but you have to change the way you produce these in these industries, and they will need to raise foreign currency again. They will need to change the power plants to produce these products. But it's a very interesting question, because it's exactly what we're trying to address now. So it's like of course it's something that we are very worried. But unfortunately, the data that we have with these multi-regional input-output matrices, they are not very disaggregated, and then we have to work with other data together to identify it. But you're completely right in terms of like going deep into the products and understanding what exactly these products are, and then what exactly and to what extent it's more like the carbon intensive of these products, and not only looking at the product as something isolated. But thank you very much.
Thanks a lot for clearing that out, Guilherme. We have another question from Luis Tiercelin. A question on, do you have any plans to incorporate a scenario analysis in this work? Meaning comparing potential impacts depending on the transition trajectories and associated average warming, be it 1.5, 2 degrees?
Well, the scenarios that we're considering here are more, it's not on the impacts on the production system, but impacts on the demand. So I completely agree with you that different scenarios will have different impacts, but the thing is, like, to what extent the countries or the, for example, now the European Commission, the European Union, to what extent they are forcing this transition to be faster or not, once you need, still need some fossil fuels for producing electricity, you cannot just stop. And so the scenarios will determine more what are these industries. And for example, gas industry. Gas, of course, is a very important industry to produce electricity, heating. To what extent this sector will be, the gas industry will be impacted? In the short term, it may be positively impacted because we're replacing other fossil fuels to gas, which is less carbon intensive. But to what extent the scenario will change and they say, okay, not gas anymore, we're going forward and moving to other sectors more carbon intensive, or considering gas as a sector that's not essential anymore. So the scenario is more on politics and deciding what are the sectors and what are these industries that will be impacted then. But the idea is to, like, of course, using different scenarios, you will have different results because you're defining different sunset industries. The sunset industries, as I said in the very beginning, they are at some point, of course, the technology is important, preferences are important, but policy is very important for them. And policy is very important to determine the scenarios.
Yes. Thanks, Guilherme. I don't see any clarification questions yet, so we'll see if there are any questions later on. So let's move on to the presentation by Sebastián. Sebastián Velde Campos, as I said, will be presented his own work and discussing the content you just presented. So to you, Sebastián.
Well, thank you, Mariana. Thank you very much, Guilherme, for the presentation. Before I start, I think that there are three main points that need to be stressed from Guilherme's presentation. I think that there are very strong points that need to be underlined. The first thing that I consider very important on Guilherme's analysis is the input-output analysis. I think that given the heterogeneity that we find among countries, it is very important when we carry out this analysis about the green transition to take into account the structural specificities of each economy. And the only way I know this can be done is through the use of input-output analysis. So I think that this is a very important insight that Guilherme's analysis brings in. The second thing that I think it is very important is the integration of different dimensions, not only the fact that the green transition has to happen, but also the impacts that this green transition will have in the social dimension, the external dimension, and the fiscal dimension. So I think this is another important thing that differs across countries, and the way Guilherme tackles this problem, I think it is a very, very interesting starting point, and is one of the strong points of the paper. And the third thing that I consider really interesting, and I didn't think about it before, is this distinction between exposure, vulnerability, and risks. I think that this is also a very interesting thing to take into account. And this is what somehow connects to the type of work I've been doing lately, which is applying this more general framework that Guilherme was talking about to one specific case, which is the case of Argentina, but I think that this framework that I've been working on in Argentina can be applied also at least to Latin American countries. I won't speak about other countries of the Global South because I am not an expert on them, but I think that at least for the case of Latin America, we can synthesize the problem of the green transition in what could be called the green transition trilemma, meaning basically that it would seem to be very difficult, given the current productive structure of these countries, to achieve these three things at the same time, to achieve economic growth, or if you will, welfare for the majority of the population, external sustainability approached by basically balance of payments sustainability, and the third dimension that is desirable is environmental sustainability. And my impression is that given the productive structure of Latin American countries, it is not possible to achieve the three things at the same time. If, for instance, Argentina wants to grow and at the same time don't hit the external constraints, it would seem that given the productive structure, that would come at the cost of sacrificing external sustainability. Because in order to grow and to produce foreign exchange, as Guillermo was saying, Argentina relies on primary exports that are environmentally not sustainable. Although the primary sector of Argentina is not in the sectors that Guillermo identified because it is more cattle raising and agriculture, it is still an important emitting sector. On the other hand, if Argentina would want to grow being consistent with environmental sustainability, that seems to come at the cost of external or balance of payments sustainability, because again, given the current productive structure, if Argentina grows without emitting so many greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, the only way of doing that under the present productive structure is by reducing the primary production and the exports. So that would come at the cost of balance of payment stability. And finally, if Argentina says, I want to achieve both external and environmental sustainability at the same time, given the current productive structure, it seems that the only way of doing that is by not growing at all, which is basically what has been happening in Argentina for the last 10 years. So the hypothesis I have is that the only way out of this green transition trilemma for Argentina in particular, but for Latin American countries in general, is through a process of structural change. By structural change, I'm not only referring to the energy transition, which is the type of structural change that is normally discussed in developed countries when we debate about the green transition, but in the specific case of Latin American countries, structural change has also had to be the long-delayed transformation of the productive structure, which would be reflected, if it happens, by a lower income elasticity of imports and a higher income elasticity of exports. That is a diversification of the consumption of the export basket, which is something similar to what Guillermo was saying when he was describing the green complexity potential. That is the possibility of developing sectors that diversify the productive structure and at the same time are environmentally sustainable. Now the question is, how do we finance the process of developing these industries? Where do we get the foreign exchange that we need in order to carry out all the investments that are required to transform the productive structure and to converge to a low carbon economy? Well, that is the question that has not been answered in most Latin American countries over the last 70 years, because since the 50s, we know that we need to go through a process of structural change, but that process of structural change has not happened yet. So seemingly, it is not so easy to achieve this process of structural change that from a hypothetical point of view, it seems quite straightforward, but when it comes to reality, for different reasons, and in my opinion, due to the balance of payments constraint, it hasn't been possible to be achieved. So methodologically, how is it that we can analyze the different transition pathways from the current situation to the desired future situation where our countries can at the same time provide their population with a good level of welfare, do not hit the balance of payments constraint, that is, be sustainable from an external point of view, and at the same time, reduce the levels of emissions of greenhouse gases. From my perspective, the best or the most interesting tool to do this is what I call, or what could be called, a stock flow input-output model. Stock flow consistent models have proved to be very interesting in combining national account data with financial account data to produce prospective analysis, that is scenario analysis, that are dynamically consistent. And input-output analysis, as we were saying before, gives us insights about the specificities of the economies that we are describing. So I think that the combination of stock flow consistent models with input-output analysis can give us a very insightful tools into the questions that need to be answered about what are the possible transitions towards a low-carbon economy in the specific case where we have a large structural heterogeneity. It might be the case that there is no possible or no stable transition. The thing is that by means of these types of models, we can get different insights about the different alternatives that we have and the different policy mixes that produce the different trajectories. So, in the specific case of Argentina, I have built a very preliminary model, I would say, with 4 institutional agents where production is disaggregated into 31 productive sectors in order to tackle this or to address these questions that Guillermo was defining as the direct and the indirect effects of the green transition. If we have the interlinkages within the productive sector, we have the possibility of knowing what happens when we apply a specific policy to one specific sector of the productive structure and how that spills over into the rest of the economy. So I'm not going to go into the details of the model. I think that what is interesting to see is how these models or the types of results or visualizations that these models can give us in order to analyze the effects of the green transition. So what you are seeing now is just the impact on GDP of Argentina under different scenarios. You have a baseline, which is the typical business as usual scenario, and then you have other trajectories where different types or different shapes of the green transitions are modeled. Of course, that this is always arbitrary, but the interesting thing is that these tools, stock flow consistent input-output models, have the flexibility of designing a wide range of policy mixes that yield different trajectories for the economy in the long run. So if you take a look specifically at the orange line, what this orange line is describing is the trajectory of GDP when a green transition process is combined with a process of structural change in the productive structure. So we are not only improving energy efficiency and greening the energy matrix, but we are also transforming or assuming a transformation of the productive structure of Argentina, meaning less imports or a lower import intensity and a more diversified export basket. Of course, I am imposing this structural change process here. I am not saying that this is something that happens automatically. This is something that happens exogenously from the modeling perspective. What I am showing here is basically what would happen in a scenario where the green transition is combined with the process of structural change. This is the impact on GDP. Now you can see the impact on the current account. In this specific graph, the current account is in deficit when you have positive figures, and it is in surplus when you have negative figures. So basically what you can see is that in most of the scenarios, when we go through a process of a green transition, the current account of Argentina is in deficit. And this is the problem. This is the green transition trilemma. If we want to undertake all the investment, all the reforms that the green transition requires, that will imply a current account deficit that has to be financed somehow. And that is the question that, at least in the case of Argentina, has not been answered yet and has not been solved yet. The only scenario where the green transition is consistent with the current account surplus is, as the orange line shows, the scenario where the green transition is accompanied by a process of structural change. Why? Basically because when structural change takes place, the economy is less reliant on imports and it has a more diversified export basket that increases the amount of foreign exchange. So the only way Argentina could go through a sustainable transition, according to these simulations, is through a process of structural change. So the last thing that I want to say is that if we go back to the idea of the green transition trilemma, and we use this visual device in order to see if there is a possibility of solving this green transition trilemma, we see that only in the scenario where Argentina combines the green transition with a process of structural change, it is possible for the country to be closer to the vertices of this shape that is heuristically trying to define the trilemma. So at the end of the day, what I want to say, and the link that I want to establish with Guillermo's presentation, is that the approach that they are taking, that you are taking at AFD, combining the structural specificities of the economies with the challenges of the transition, is the way to go from my perspective. And that has to be combined with a dynamic framework that tells us what are the possible trajectories from the starting point today to the place that we want to be in the future. We have to see what are the different pathways, what are the ones that are really sustainable from the perspective of the external sector, and as Guillermo was saying, the fiscal sector as well, and the social impacts of those transitions. And the perspective I have is that environmental stock flow consistent input-output models are the tool that give us the highest level of flexibility to try out different policy combinations that yield the different trajectories. So this is basically what I wanted to share with you. Thanks again for the presentation. And of course, I hope to be in touch with you to see how we can join efforts in the process of developing better modeling tools. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Sebastian, for this very insightful presentation. I think it was very useful on one hand for you to make a point on the key takeaways of the work that Guillermo presented, as well as sharing with us your specific work and this very clear vision of the green transition trilemma on a specific case for Argentina. A lot of avenues for collaboration that have been identified. I'm very interested to follow up on this. So I don't see, for the time being, any clarification questions in the chat, but I want to invite the audience to ask those questions as we move on. So finally, we can have our last speaker, Cécile Valadier, who will be presenting as well our vision of how to integrate the work presented by Guillermo to our own methods. Go ahead, Cécile.
Thank you, Mariana, and thank you, Guillermo and Sebastian, for the presentations, which I found very informative. I think Sebastian clearly described how this kind of analysis can be the starting point of a public policy discussion at the country level, because the analysis provides a map of a country's vulnerability on the macro side when it comes to the global transition to less carbon-intensive economic development. Then it helps formulating simply the trade-offs countries are facing, and Sebastian went into detail on that. So I won't touch on this issue, even though it's very much in AFD's mandate to have this kind of conversation with the countries we support and we invest in, along with helping them, of course, reducing the vulnerabilities that can be identified. I will instead focus my discussion on a different point, and Mariana mentioned it at the beginning of this presentation, which is how these kind of research results can be used by financial institutions to integrate climate risk into their sovereign and country risk assessments. This is an important issue for a financial institution like AFD. And it's especially the case because we all know that lower rated sovereigns have greater vulnerability to climate change. So it's important to really assess the risk and opportunities from the low carbon transition. And I will also touch upon what I find particularly interesting in the study and how, in my opinion, it adds value to the literature on the subject, which is basically emerging at the moment and not finalized yet. So I think there's been quite a bit of work done on physical climate risk when it comes to macroeconomic impacts. We see the impacts today already. We have many indicators that are developed to account for countries or firms' exposure and sensitivity to physical risk. I have in mind, for instance, the quantification of the cost of extreme weather events that can be relatively straightforward in terms of GDP or in terms of fiscal revenue. So this is work area that has been progressing much more quickly, I would say. And the link with sovereign risk is starting to be well established. I have in mind a study by Standard & Poor's that shows that historically, for instance, natural disaster might lead to sudden downgrades by 1.5 notches on average for countries that are affected. And the beauty of the paper is that it focuses on transition risk, and these are more elusive to capture. And it gives a simple and powerful framework to guide our thinking on this issue by delving precisely on the production processes at the country level and linking them to macro and socioeconomic variables that are relevant for sovereign risk analysis. So the channels through which the transition to a low carbon economy can impact sovereign risk are usually well covered in the literature. If you look at papers on these issues, you will see that we have a good understanding on how things could work. And I will briefly link the three indicators you present in the paper, which are the ability to raise foreign exchange from net exports, the ability to raise fiscal revenue, and the socioeconomic vulnerabilities to what can constitute a country's creditworthiness. And then I will say in which dimension I find the paper really interesting and differentiating from the literature. First, on the indicator on net foreign currency generated by exports. We know that the low carbon transition, as Guillaume mentioned, will have impacts on international trade, on what a country imports or exports. And we also know that historically, balance of payments problems have often been at the root of country risk and have often been the starting point to external debt crisis. So if we have protracted current account imbalances, these tend to cause liquidity problems. And these liquidity problems can in turn lead to solvency problems. So major changes to a country's current account position might have deep impacts on foreign exchange reserves. And these foreign exchange reserves are a measure of the ability of a country and a sovereign to repay its foreign currency debt. So that's why I think it's very useful to focus on these type of indicators. On the fiscal side, of course, the ability to raise fiscal revenue is negatively correlated with the sovereign risk, because when you are able to raise fiscal revenue and when it's easy to do so, you reduce your reliance on debt financing to finance all the expenditure. It also enhances a country's ability to have counter-cyclical policies in the event of a shock. You're more able to cushion its effects. And what the paper shows is that heavy fiscal reliance on sunset industry will erode a country's ability to finance basic social and infrastructure spending. And this doesn't even mention the ability of the country to finance the transition itself. Of course, if you have to pay for investment or to pay to mitigate the social impacts of this transition, then you will have added fiscal cost to take into account. So on the fiscal revenue side, I think it's a very nice and synthetic measure of what the transition can do on your public finance. And then on the third indicator, sociopolitical instability can undermine a country's willingness or ability to repay its debt. It can be because if you have a high level of spending to maintain social peace in the absence of social safety nets. It can be difficult to withdraw this high level of spending. It can be also because socio-political instability will make it more difficult for you to implement structural reform that could be needed. So we know that socio-political instability can have an impact on debt sustainability as well. Through this mechanism. And I think the indicator that is chosen in the paper that we could have large-scale disruptions in employment and wages from a low-carbon transition, this can be an important vector of social-political instability. So as I said, the broad theoretical mechanism, which I very roughly synthesized here, are well known. And in my view, the first important contribution of the paper is that it takes into account the interdependence of economies and sectors by looking at both a direct and indirect exposure for each production process. We know that feedback loops can amplify the initial losses that the country might be facing, and these feedback loops are not easily captured by looking at typical macro variables. So if I look at the structure of a country's exports, for instance, I could be reassured by the fact that at first view, it doesn't seem to rely too much on set industries. I could say, okay, so it's not, it should not be a big deal for this country if the transition happens. While in fact, you could have countries where the indirect exposure is high, and this won't be seen unless you go at the micro level, and as Sebastian was mentioning as well. Moreover, we know that changes in behaviors or regulations or policies in trading partners might affect your situation as a country, even in the absence of any change within the country in terms of behaviors, regulations, or policies. So this kind of analysis allows you to take that into account as well. And I think it's very important to give a clear picture of the vulnerabilities of the structure of your economy and your exports. The second main contribution of the paper, in my view, is to quantify the magnitude of a country's exposure. And in my opinion, it goes one step beyond what I have seen in the literature on that. Because if we understand the mechanisms, we don't always have a way to quantify them properly. And this analysis will tell you exactly what percentage of net foreign currency receipts or fiscal revenue actually depend on sunset industries. So I think this is really helpful in quantifying the risk and maybe ranking the vulnerabilities for country. And I would echo also what Sebastian said about the importance of this multidimensional analysis, because I find it especially important to maintain this multidimensional nature of the results. And I would therefore advocate that we should resist the temptation to aggregate transition risk into a single measure, at least too early in the analysis, because there's a lot of expert judgment when you assess sovereign risk. And you need to be able to look at the most micro level available in terms of data. And that's what the paper is trying to do. And to understand what exactly could be driving the result from this type of quantitative analysis. And this will help you make the right call in terms of exposure and vulnerability. And this brings me to the third contribution of the paper, which I think is that it does a very nice job at looking at factors that mitigate the basic quantitative results on exposure. For instance, when looking at the dependence of net foreign receipts from sunset industries, you will look at the product emission intensity index that adds information on the emission intensity of a country's export basket beyond the broad sectoral characterization. And I think this echoes what Guillaume was saying at the end of the presentation, which is how can we go deeper beyond saying that this or this industry is a sunset industry into the product level and what their vulnerabilities are. So it could be that within a sunset industry broadly defined, then you are more exposed on products that are less intensive in terms of emission, and maybe you are less exposed than what the very aggregate level could let you believe. On the fiscal revenue side, you also analyze the potential to tax other industries, and I think it's very important. If you have fallback options, then maybe you're not that vulnerable. And this for all the dimension that you look at, you combine each time to give a measure of the dynamic and the possible evolutions for countries in the future. You have this very interesting measure of the capacity of a country to adapt to the transition with the grid complexity potential indicator. And I think that's a definite effort on the part of the analysis to account for several dimensions and dimensions of resilience to the transition, and this within countries, the countries that have mitigating factors against the exposure and the risk. This will ultimately determine what the transition risks really are. I think this type of analysis therefore gives very strong foundations to assess how transition risk might impact a country's creditworthiness. Nevertheless, I would argue that the analysis does not stop there. We've seen with Sebastian how this can be applied in terms of public policy dialogue to say, okay, what are the trade-offs and how do we look at trajectories and see what impact they have. On the risk side as well, luckily there's still work for country risk economists to get a better grasp on this important issue. And I would see at least two main areas where we could go deeper. I think we could do more work on the public sector balance sheet as a whole. I'm thinking in particular, we could look into more details at how public expenditure and revenue could be impacted by low carbon transition. It could be negatively, as you said, through this fiscal reliance on certain industries. It could be through increased spending to mitigate the effects of the transition on firms, on households, as I mentioned as well. It could be positively as well if you're in a world where you can phase out fossil fuel subsidies, or you can generate revenue from carbon taxes. So this has to be assessed in a net way, like we do for the export revenues net of import content. And I think on the fiscal revenue, we have to take into account expenditure as well. On the public sector balance sheet, I would say also that there could be specific work done on assessing the contingent liabilities and how they could materialize on the sovereign balance sheet because of the transition. In particular, I'm thinking of specific SOEs that in countries that could rely a lot on carbon intensive technologies or that have a business model that is dependent on sunset sectors. I am thinking, of course, about the financial institution, the financial sector that we know could be a big contingent liability, and a lot of work is done on assessing the risk at the financial level from the low carbon transition. And at some point, I think it would be interesting to link these two issues, sovereign risk and the financial sector risk, to see what could ultimately end up being borne by the public sector balance sheet. And the second axis of development that I see would be that we could do maybe more work on the opportunities that the low carbon transition might entail for countries. So you as I mentioned, you have some explanation in the paper on how to mitigate the rough measure of exposure and what should be taken into account. I think we could go maybe a bit beyond that and thinking of the opportunities that might arise for countries that are well endowed in some material that are necessary to support the development of clean technologies. I'm not completely sure, but maybe you will explain a bit in more detail that the green complex product potential indicator fully captures this dimension. But I think it's important to also have a view on the plus side of what the transition might bring in terms of opportunities for some country. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cécile. This was very useful, and you did a very good summary of the key contributions of the paper, as well as you propose some ideas in terms of axis of development that, as I can see, also bring up some of the connections that we can have between the work that was presented by Guillerme and Sebastian. So we have some additional questions in the chat. One question related to how AFD is included in this type of analysis in public policy dialogue, and how is this being received by partner countries. Another question on how this is incorporated in projects that are financed by the AFD. So maybe these are questions that could be addressed by Guillerme and Cécile.
Maybe I can start, Guillerme, and you follow up. Just to say that we are at the beginning of the work on these issues. So now that we have a clear framework on how to think about that, I think showing, for instance, at the country level, what are the vulnerabilities? What do you position compared to other countries in terms of the fiscal, the external vulnerability and the socio-economic vulnerability? Is a good way to start a discussion on these issues and to start a discussion on what the plans are to address these vulnerabilities. So I would say we're just starting on that, and we are quite excited to have this kind of tool to help us guide the discussion in a research-based manner.
Yeah, I will try to mix these two questions, which are definitely Louis questions that are very interesting, with a little bit on what Sebastian talked and also Cécile. Well, we are starting, as Cécile said, we are starting now with this project. It's like in the very beginning, we just published the methodological paper on these, and we are working on refinements on these. For example, the things that Claudio are discussing are something that we're very, very up to, or even the scenarios things that we're discussing. And here at the GEMS team, which is the team that work with these analysis, we have models which are not very similar, but follow the same line as Sebastian models, because this is a static perspective. We're looking at what the situation the countries are now, and when we use these to analyze the impact of scenarios or policies, we need to have models like the model that Sebastian presented, and especially the stock flow consistent input-output models, they provide a very interesting insight on the possible policies that you can apply. For example, carbon price, the effectiveness of carbon price in one country can be very different from the other if we have different structure of production and trade. The importance of green bonds, the importance of, like, to what extent a Green New Deal can be effective if you have fiscal issues, because the Green New Deal is obviously something that needs a lot of investment. So basically, when we're talking about these dialogues, we need other models, we need other instruments or other tools, but this one is a starting point to say, okay, what kind of model we have to build for this country, given the situation they have. What are when we're building a model where we're going to analyze this public policies that can be public, like policy tools in general that one country can have for the transition, we need to look at the specificities of the country, the idiosyncrasies of the country. Otherwise, we are just doing like models that are they are not saying anything about the country itself. They are saying about the they are more too much theoretically. And then just for clarification, we are starting with the first project where we are using this data, this methodological approach actually, to analyze a specific country. And fortunately, this country has very interesting input-output data, which is Uzbekistan. And we can analyze more specifically the sectors, more specifically the products that they are exporting, how these products are different within in terms of comparing to the rest of the world in terms of emissions. So I think we're, as I said, it's a starting point, it's something that we're starting now, but I really think that it can bring some important insights for understanding a little bit on the idiosyncrasies, the specificities of the countries, and going a little bit more on the points that Cici asked me and want to discuss on the green complexity potential. I think it brings us just for clarifying what is this economic of complexity. The idea is basically that if one country export or produce one product, they can move to some other products than other countries. For example, if I produce car engines, I can easily move to the production of cars because I already produce the engines. Or if I produce car engines, I can easily produce trucks. So there are some relationship between products. And the idea of this green complexity potential, which is developed by, I don't know, and I cannot say the name, is a very difficult one, but they work in the London School, LSE, London School of Economics. It's the idea that if you produce some specific products that use the same technologies, use the same capabilities as the green products, and China is a country that does this a lot and produce all these products, they can more easily move to these products when you have during the transition process. And this is interesting because it's a dynamic perspective. We're moving from a static perspective, we're looking just a picture of the country, and you're thinking, okay, we have this picture of the country, we have this idea what the country is doing now, but based on this idea that the country is this picture that we have of the country, we can identify some possibilities that the country can move to. And of course, it depends on the speed of the transition, again, on the scenarios. If it is we are reaching a scenario of 2 degrees very fast, I'm pretty sure that the pressure will be to a higher and faster transition because you need to do these, otherwise a lot of countries will be impacted in terms of a lot of population, especially the poorest population will be impacted, and then you need to enter in a fast process of transition. And this fast transition will be more negatively, will impact more negatively those countries that are more exposed and present low complexity than those countries that are less exposed and present high complexity. So, I'm trying to respond to all these questions together, but the idea is that we have to look at different things together when you're having this public dialogue and this dialogue with countries. And about how the partner countries receive it, we don't know yet. At least with Uzbekistan, it seems to be well received because they say, okay, we want to discuss with you and maybe have something like this for Uzbekistan to understand a little bit more on our exposures and our risks.
Thanks a lot, Guillermo, Guillermo and Cecile, for very complete answers and a lot of opportunities that we hope will emerge in order to feed in our public policy dialogue, taking into use these new methods that have been developed and the availability of data, because that's definitely a key requisite in order to fulfill this analysis. So we have other very interesting questions. One from Luis on what can AFD do for countries that are very threatened by climate change and therefore may have a negative sovereign debt outlook. and as such could not be good candidates for getting more loans. I don't know if perhaps Cécile, you want to take that one, or Guillaume?
Yeah, of course. No, I think one needs to remember first that AFD intervenes in a lot of countries that have negative sovereign debt outlook. Not all countries, but in the aftermath of the COVID-19 crisis, we see a lot of sovereigns that are in more difficulty than they were before, and it's typical side of our work to work in this country. So that's one point. On the second point, of course, whether it's because AFD will finance them or because the countries will need to invest to mitigate impacts of climate risk, or to even invest to adapt to the climate risk impacts. There's a conundrum here between the ability to do so without borrowing more money and degrading the sovereign balance sheet. So it's a very difficult trade-off. I think it's going to be more and more important. I would refer to the fact that these are questions that are talked a lot in the international community, and there's a lot of discussions on what can we do on the debt side to alleviate the constraints for the poorest countries. So you have in mind the fact that during the crisis, some debt service was suspended for the poorest countries in the world, and from the G20. So this is the debt service suspension initiative. There have also been talks about restructuring the sovereign debt for some countries that faced unsustainable levels. And I think more and more people are thinking about linking these restructurings and the fact that you could alleviate the debt burden for some countries to the necessity to finance environmentally sustainable policies, or the ability of the country to face climate change risk. So these are ideas that are starting to gain momentum in the international community, and I think they're promising avenues, because there are not a lot of them that are available at the moment.
Thanks a lot, Cécile. So maybe this brings, this is a nice transition to a question, a more general, broad question that we had on the chat, that is very much mentioning the crisis situation we faced, the whole planet faced due to the COVID situation, and the fact that there needs to be a balance needs to be found between this necessity to move on to the low carbon and climate resilient transition, and the balance that needs to be found between the different solutions that are going to perceive and take into account also the fact that there is an unemployment crisis. So a question perhaps to all the panelists: what would be your ideas for this sustainable recovery? Maybe the trilemma that Sebastian mentioned, it's even more complex than we imagined. So any ideas that we can bring in now, I think it would be a nice way to close this discussion.
I think, I don't know if Sebastian wants to start, because we were talking about it. So, but
yeah, I think that one of the interesting ideas that have been raised recently is to create a kind of a trust fund with the special SDR allocation that has been issued this year, and since the majority of those SDR have been allocated to developed countries that might not be the ones that need to, I mean, they need to go through a process of transition, but they don't face the external constraints. So it would be interesting that developing countries can have access a larger share of these SDR allocation in order to have more room of maneuver to deal with the challenges that the green transition implies in terms of the external constraint. So this is just a proposal that has been raised, but as far as I know, it is being debated in the G20, the possibility of creating this trust fund to redistribute the SDR allocations that have been issued a few months ago. So that is just one option, but I think that surely we should think, or we should try to think global solutions to the transition risks that occur at the individual level or at the country level, because at the end of the day, we need all countries to be embarked in the transition. So if we leave each specific country to deal with its own problems, it might be the case that many countries decide not to go through the transition because they don't, or they cannot overcome the trilemma. So at the end of the day, I think that this is something that has to be thought at a global scale, and that is why it comes to my mind, this idea of the trust fund with the SDR allocation that can be an interesting way to start thinking about these solutions.
And to complement what Sebastian is saying, I think this trust fund is completely geared towards financing climate transitions and maybe also anything linked to environment as well. So it would be under the supervision of the IMF, and I think based on sustainability issues, based on resilience issues, and get towards financing this type of investment or issues.
Yeah. Just a point that I think it's interesting when we are looking at this. Before the COVID crisis, we used to have a lot of constraints in countries' indebtedness, like because it's all the fiscal rules are based on these, and either the countries are imposing themselves these fiscal rules, or they are some other institutions are imposing them to provide finance. And the COVID crisis shows that if you have a specific project, in the case of the COVID, if you have a specific project that you need to spend some money, for example, vaccines or health issues, you can try the idea that or like bonds are not something homogeneous or something that they are marked with some they are specific for some projects, they are specific for some issues. We can have a different combination of financing that can provide these fundings for the transition, or for the in the case of the COVID, for supporting these health issues that were necessary. And what I see during, at least I could see during the COVID crisis, is that we have space for governments to invest in more in specific projects, and if it is well defined, it's for example, a country that want to move from a fossil fuel electricity base to a more renewable electricity base, and find ways to find it through multilateral organisms, or directly through the financial markets. You can find a way to manage to do these. Of course, we need to have specific agencies, specific systems that consolidate these ideas and say, okay, this is indeed a project that will make the country, it will contribute a lot to the national determined contributions for the Paris Agreement. So I think there are much more space for these than just saying that, because before the COVID crisis, basically what we had was countries that they had limits on debt, they had limit on spending, and now what we see is that spending and debt are not something that's a homogeneous thing. They are different according to the project, according to the even expenses. If it is social expense, are completely different than other types of expenses, social and health expenses, and investment in specific projects, especially green projects, can be very fruitful and can be financed by, not completely financed, but then you can have find a way to finance these projects. So I think the COVID crisis shows that things are much more complicated for good than, at least in this point, than before, because before it was just like, okay, the country must have a deficit limit of 3%, and then you cannot go beyond these. And now what you can see is that it's much more complex than these. You can find ways to finance this deficit if it is destined for specific investment, specific spendings.
Thanks a lot to you three. I think this was very interesting to listen to. Of course, there are new opportunities that we hope will emerge as this SDR mechanism comes to life, hopefully. And of course, as you clearly point out, Guillermo, the issue that we have to finance this sustainable recovery definitely needs to be taken into account the fact that all countries need to embark in this low carbon transition if we want to at least continue dreaming of being close to the much desired and needed global goals of limiting global warming. So thanks a lot to you all, and thanks a lot to the audience. I see that we still have some questions that unfortunately we cannot address as we have reached the time, but very interesting discussion, and we shared the link to the paper. So of course, do not hesitate to go into depth into it and contact the authors if you have any ideas or questions. And you will be receiving the replay of this session later on, and it will be uploaded in our YouTube channel, so we can keep engaging. So thanks a lot to you all, and we hope you have a nice rest of the day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.